Good day, everyone. This is a video documentary that explains the fiscal policy and economic developments in Lagos since 1900. This documentary has the view of an economic historian and also a financial analyst who gave their views on economy and fiscal policy of Lagos since 1900, which is the beginning of our period of study. Lagos, popularly known as Eko Akete Ilu Ogbon, is a kaleidoscope of cultural expressions and innovations. It is described as a state, a geographical core around which identities, boundaries, and definition of purpose have been shifted and adjusted over several centuries. The economy, therefore, is a major factor of Lagos's development.
Amayode Olukoju, the distinguished professor of history at the University of Lagos. I major in maritime, economic, and social history. I've been teaching at the University of Lagos since September of 1987, even though I had earlier taught at the Ogun State University from 1984 to 87. I completed my PhD thesis on the maritime trade of Lagos, and over the years, I've published on that topic and on Nigeria, Japanese, and other ports. Well, if you're taking a benchmark from 1900, we need to understand that theoretically, or for the sake of convenience, 1900 is taken as the commencement of colonial rule in Nigeria. But we know that Lagos had been a colony effectively from 1861, and that some parts of Nigeria were not under colonial rule until well into the 1910s, 1920s. So when we say colonial rule, the commencement date differs from place to place. So for convenience, we've taken 1900. And for Lagos as an entity, in 1900, Lagos was just a colony. And a colony with its protectorate, that is the places that were acquired by the British in the immediate hinterland of Lagos. But in 1906, Lagos became part of the colonial protectorate of southern Nigeria by virtue of amalgamation. And in 1914, southern and southern Nigeria were amalgamated. So when we talk of Lagos now, we're talking of Lagos under different administrations. So we can say that the economy of Lagos expanded gradually from what it used to be in the 19th century. In the 19th century, before the British took over, it was a center of the slave trade. And after 1851, it became the center of the anti-slavery squadron, fighting against slavery. But ultimately, what was called the legitimate trade took over, and Lagos became a beneficiary because it was the major outlet for the trade of the Nigerian hinterland. So Lagos was the seat of the colonial administration, and after 1914 and until 1981, it was the seat of the Nigerian Federation, that is the Nigerian nation as we know it. So in terms of economic development, you could say that Lagos could be seen the nursery of everything that we now experience in Nigeria. So the economy of Lagos then grew as the city grew in size, and as it also grew in importance. The oil boom was reflected in the expansion, for example, of Lagos Port. The long and short of it is that over time, Lagos had been a recipient of several dynamics, one of which was the fact that it was an administrative center all through its life until 1991. And even in 1991, when the federal capital was relocated to Abuja, Lagos still remained as the center of Nigerian politics and even the economy. And today we can say that Lagos, it has been established that Lagos, if it was a country, Nigeria would be number 5 in terms of the GDP generated by Lagos in its economy. So we can say that Lagos, in a sense, still remains the part of place as a commercial center, as an industrial center, whether you're talking of insurance or banking and other activities. Lagos is also the leading center in Nigeria. So altogether, in terms of GDP, Lagos has risen through the decades. Well, the economic development of Lagos, primarily as a commercial center, as I said, was a magnet that drew people to the city. When we talk about, I delivered a lecture, the keynote of the Lagos Studies Association, entitled "Which Lagos? Whose History?" in which I posed two questions there. One of the questions being that when you talk of Lagos, which Lagos are you referring to? Is it the Lagos, the original Lagos, that is Lagos Island, or is it metropolitan Lagos, Lagos that is mainland and island, or is it Lagos State? So it depends on which Lagos we are talking about. But if you are talking about Lagos as a metropolis, the expansion of Lagos as a metropolis has been phenomenal. The implication of that is that as Lagos expanded, population exploded, it also meant that Lagos now spread in an outward direction, eastward towards Ikorodu, northwards towards Agege. So the challenges are there. The challenges of housing. There's also the problem of transportation. People have to commute. So by and large, you can say that, yes, on the one hand, Lagos has developed, Lagos has become prosperous, but on the other hand, there have been social cost of living and all that. So development, as far as the GDP is the highest for Nigeria and there may be perhaps even for West Africa, and that's exactly what you see. You also see that Lagos is cosmopolitan. Lagos has been the destination of foreign capital, people investing in massive. So in a nutshell, that's Lagos in terms of economic development, which we need to understand cuts both ways. Pressure is exerted on infrastructure, the roads, electricity, water, housing, everything, health services. So to have a balanced picture, a balanced view of whether the Lagos state governments have done well or have not done well, you have to strike a balance between the revenue that comes in and how it is managed, and people's refusal, even when they have the ability to pay tax. So that's the problem for Lagos. If you go back to 1900, which is like casting our net far and wide, we say authoritatively that one major lesson to learn from how the economy has been managed here is that every state, every government, whether national or federal, whether state or federal, should take advantage of what is called its comparative advantage. Lagos' comparative advantage is that it has a seaport, and therefore the seaport has been the hub of the Lagos economy and society. In fact, the sea has defined Lagos. Lagos has actually has excelled, has demonstrated how you can run a multicultural, cosmopolitan entity, taking power and resources to the grassroots. So I believe that Lagos is the most modern state in Nigeria. It has adopted the most modern methods of administration. During the colonial period, of course, Lagos was run as an enclave. They had just an administrator of the colony who was more or less like a lieutenant governor, but the territory was very small, and it had a concentration of high government officials, including the governor of Nigeria and the chief justice and all that. The tasks are quite huge, and I believe that so far so good. They've done their best. They could do better, far better, but then.
I'm a professional economist with a doctorate in economics and recently accepted a professorial chair at one of the private universities in Nigeria. And I am also a business owner, having set up a consultancy in 1993, and we began operations in March 1994. So that is it essentially. Thank you very much. If we talk about fiscal policy, as I'm sure you understand it, that speaks to how governments generate revenue and how they spend it, in which case you are looking at two major planks: the fund they raised and how they use the fund. Now, if you look at Lagos State specifically, which is a sub-national within Nigeria, number one is that before independence in 1960, the economy basically was agrarian, in the sense that a lot of what we produced and also what we had as foreign earnings, as well as employment, was largely driven by activities in the agricultural sector. Now, prior to then, we had about 70 to 80% of our population employed in agriculture. It was not any different for Lagos State. Because looking at the period from which we are, having this conversation, 1900, I mean, basically, our economy was still rural, so to say. And as we say also in economic history, we were an appendage of the metropolis. The economy of Lagos State, you can say, has three major planks. The agri part to it, then there was fishing, and of course, there was also trade, being a coastal town at the time, okay? But as more people, because of the trade in particular, and also being a port city, where whatever we export from Nigeria also left coming from the hinterland, went out to the port. Now, Lagos became significant in that instance. So trade flourished. So more people were attracted to Lagos. As more people started flowing into Lagos, the place of agriculture began to diminish. So Lagos became more of a commercial center, and of course, also a port city for exports and imports. So when we now got to post-independence, that was when Lagos began to evolve. And of course, in terms of fiscal policy, we did not see much for Lagos until about 1973, 1974. And that was when we now had in place, of course, it was a military government, quite all right. Very good. Now, as I said in my first response to your question, the economy of Lagos State has evolved over the years. And if you look at Lagos State today, the GDP, number one, is so big that when you take Lagos State and put it beside all other African countries, Lagos is among the top 10. How the focus of fiscal policy was on critical infrastructure and those aspects that impacted life directly. So that also ultimately improved the Human Development Index, HDI, which of course we deal with literacy, we deal with health. They also spent a lot of money on the hospital system, that's the medical facilities as well. So that phase went on a reform of taxation in Lagos State. And they didn't do much at that time other than say, look, whenever you need any service from Lagos State government, we not ask you directly to pay for it, but for you to benefit from that, we ask you to show evidence that you are a taxpayer. The civilian government of 1979 to 83 introduced, which was a core element of their fiscal policy too, on education. Education was free, which case you didn't need to pay school fees in Lagos State schools, primary, secondary. That, of course, also had its own influence in the influx of people from other states in Nigeria into Lagos. And that was when Lagos State began to grow its internally generated revenue, IGR. Okay? Now, that was the first part. They now said, if we can apply technology, we can actually improve what we receive. And how do we also ensure that civil servants that are in charge don't cut corners, which means what should come to government as revenue doesn't end up in private pockets. So technology played a role. The internally generated revenue of Lagos State had become quite robust. And that was also why it was not so difficult for Lagos State government to support its own local government when federal government seized the allocation for local government to Lagos State, because Lagos State government created other local governments, which of course the federal government argued was unconstitutional. And they said, okay, we won't call them local government. We call them local community development authorities, SCDA. Good question. Now, it will connect to some of the things I said earlier on. There's something we call debt capacity. That means your capacity to repay the loan you take, as well as servicing. That means there are basically two obligations when you take a loan. The first obligation is to repay the loan at maturity. That means the agreed date for you to pay back. The second obligation is the interest and other charges on the loan. That's the one we call servicing. So when you put the two together, in measuring your debt capacity to find out your ability to repay the loan amount itself, the principal sum you took, and then to discharge your obligations on the servicing of that loan. Now, when you grow your IGR, that's internally generated revenue, which comes mostly from economic activities taking place within your boundaries. That is the first thing that any credit grantor will look at. So the more you generate there, the more capable you are in extinguishing your matured obligations. So for Lagos State, therefore, IGR over time has become bigger than what it receives from the Federation account. All right? So when you look at Federation account, which is subject to the vagaries of the oil market, that is not, let me say, sustainable. But the IGR is sustainable because it derives from economic activities taking place within Lagos State. So given that, therefore, what most credit grantors look at is that IGR, capacity of Lagos State to pay. So every time Lagos State will therefore approach a credit grantor, maybe any of the multilateral agencies, multilateral are the likes of the World Bank, IMF, of course. IMF does mostly national. They don't deal with, subnational. But the World Bank and other development partners, then bilateral agreements and so on and so forth. Now, all of these are aimed at one thing. If we take any loan, we don't need a loan to pay salaries of our employees in Lagos State. That's what the government will tell you. So you find that all the loans Lagos State government takes are project loans. And that is the beauty of the sustainability of the loans taken by Lagos State government. They are all project loans because from its IGR, it conveniently takes care of its employees. It conveniently takes care of its retirees. So it doesn't need even money from Federation account. So you can see how the fiscal, policy of Lagos State evolved over time. For people to do business successfully, they will therefore pay more taxes when they are making money in Lagos. And that will also make the economy to grow. So that is a narrative of how the fiscal policy in Lagos State has evolved over the decades. The system up until now talks about minimum tax. That means whether you made profit or not, there's a minimum tax you must pay. But by law, statutorily, we are mandated to pay minimum tax. Thank you.